Sexuality Studies at Northwestern University. She's a sociology graduate from USC and has been involved in computer engineering as her undergraduate background, but made a shift into sociology with a special emphasis on gender, sexuality, and queer studies. And if I can just read a line here, her work in general goes towards integrating queer studies into the larger social sciences and creating a transnational understanding of sexuality that puts pressure on the ways in which the West continues to serve as a constitutive outside for Western sexualities. So among many other things, she's a candidate for our Turkish Studies position, and we thank Gender and Women's Studies for making her available to us in this extra special interview format. So without further ado, let us have Who Killed Ahmet Yıldız, Sex, Citizenship, and Justice in a Transnational World.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And, thank you so much for the invitation and hosting me to both School of Middle East and North Africa Studies and to the Institute of LGBT Studies. And before I start, a huge thanks to Susan for spearheading this, for Leila being a wonderful hostess the entire day, and for Laura, Megan, and Miriam for making this a very pleasurable trip. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my larger book project first, and then we'll focus on one of the stories I tell in it to give you a sense of how I place my work into intersection of queer studies and Middle East studies coming from a background in sociology. I will not talk too much about how I relate to sociology, what influences me because of the audience we have in the room, but I'm more than happy to talk about it during the Q&A. So this intersection helps me craft a particular approach to transnational sexualities that pays simultaneous attention to language, meaning, and discourse, and to social structures such as nation state and citizenship, family, and religion. So this is sort of the intersection, right? Like that informs my book, Queer in Translation. So the book, Queer in Translation, Paradoxes of Westernization and Sexual Others in the Turkish Nation, traces the travel and translation of concepts and idioms of non-normative genders and sexualities to the non-Western yet Westernizing context of contemporary Turkey. So on the queer studies side, my work is inspired by Laura and Stoller, who has shown that Foucault's history of sexuality is an incomplete account of a history of sexuality, as it failed to see the colonies as the constitutive outside of European bourgeois sexuality. She argues that the anxieties around and the regulation of the sexual relationships between white Europeans and the colonized men and women has been key to both the governing of the colonies and to the construction and maintenance of a European white respectable self. My work is also inspired by scholars such as Tom Bolstorff and Martin Manalansan, who have eloquently demonstrated how sexual globalization is uneven, unexpected, nonlinear, non-homogeneous, especially by showing how identity categories such as gay and lesbian are taken on and transformed by their respectively Filipino and Indonesian queer subjects, and how these subjects formations are enabled by and hence speak back to social processes such as diaspora and nation-state formation. I am also inspired by the work of Jackie Alexander, Chandan Reddy, Fatima Al-Tayeb, and Jasper Poir, who are also scholars who focus on sexuality's role in nation-state formation, sovereignty, and dynamics of racialization. On the Middle East studies side, my work is sort of deeply inspired by and owes to the scholarship of Edward Said, who demonstrated the discursive basis for global othering and asymmetries by showing the production of the Orient, in quotes, as a knowable object of study and a consistent, coherent, and self-referential archive. The power of language and knowledge production is central to my project, as you will see, especially the ways in which these play into civilizational discourses, both within Turkey and in transnational circuits that pass through Turkey. In this sense, I find Stoller's work to be a perfect companion to Said's, as race and sexuality have been historically co-constitutive and tied to civilizational concerns. I'm also indebted to the intellectual pressure scholars such as Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmoud put on the very categories of thought we do our scholarship with, and to scholars such as Lila Abulukhod, Afsaneh Najmabadi, Joseph Massad, and Paul Amar, who have shown the significance of gender and sexuality to global asymmetries between nations and their importance to nation-state building projects, as well as states' control of their citizen subjects in the Middle East. Finally, Turkish scholars such as Meltem Ihıskad, Dicle Kouacıoğlu, Nükhet Sırman, and Deniz Kandiyoti who have theorized power, nation-state, gender, and sexuality in Turkey, have paved the way in Turkish studies that I walk on, or at least do my best. So as this intellectual genealogy shows, this project is very much formed by my understanding of sexual regulation as central to modern regimes of power. Here I'm defining sexual regulation rather broadly, and I'm in fact more interested in forms of extrajudicial regulation or unexpected indirect applications of law rather than a literal reading of regulation of laws. And Turkey provides a great case for these purposes, as homosexuality, transsexuality, and transvestism are not illegal according to Turkish law and have never been, with a short exceptional period following the 1980 military coup where trans and cross-dressing performers, most notably Turkey's diva Bülent Ersoy, were banned from performing on stage. And for those of you who might not know her, so here's an image of her from that period where she is there's some debate about when and by whom this picture was taken, but she's most likely being courted to the Buca jail from the courthouse her case was being heard. So while the foundation, So while the foundation of the Republic, so the heavy discouragement or criminalization of other forms of sexuality that were considered uncivilized and backwards, such as polygamy, Islamic matrimony, arranged marriage, and relative marriages, homosexuality, transsexuality, and transvestism have not been targeted as openly as these other forms of sexuality. They certainly have never been targeted as uncivilized, or perhaps better put, unfit for çağdaş medeniyetler seviyesi level of contemporary civilizations, which was a sort of level goal set by the founder of Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, for the new nation. In my second book project, I'm looking at these uncivilized, in quote, sexualities, openly otherized by the Republic, which are still practiced today by different segments of the population. I call this project Failures of Westernization, inspired by Jack Halberstam's work, who's one of my mentors, that suggests we treat failure as an alternative place for knowledge production. Hence, through looking both at the history of their exclusion, either legally or through civilizational narratives, and their contemporary persistence, I will think through what these failures tell us about the Westernization project and civilization in return. So, while a full history of the quiet and extrajudicial heteronormalization of the Turkish Republic remains yet to be written, and I'm hoping that maybe one of the graduate students here would be interested in taking up this project. There are little clues, somebody has to write it. There are little clues to this in some scholarship on Turkey. So these include things such as breaking down of the old architecture that distinguish between haremlik and selamlık, the women's and man's side of the home, and shifting to an architecture where the parental bedroom was the center of the home and the marker of progress, versus sex segregation as backwards. A general emphasis on monogamous adult marriage and criminalization of polygamy, and hence the removal of multiple adult bodies from the home. A shift from public baths to in-home baths as more hygienic, and as a result, a significant reduction of the attendance in men's and women's hammams. So as you can see, there have been quite shifts in the architecture and spatial organization of life that have reduced the prevalence of sex segregation and positioned it as backwards, versus co-ed spaces where men and women socialize together, such as Republican balls, as the desired civilized mode of socializing. So one of the questions I had before starting the research was, what happens when this kind of silence around such sort of quiet heterosexualization and heteronormalization of a nation breaks down? Right? How do conversations around eşcinsellik, homosexuality, and LGBT issues enter into larger national politics, and how does state regulation shift accordingly? Through tracing the stories of the stories that emerged during my fieldwork, some of which continue to unfold today, I look at how concepts that surround non-normative genders and sexualities, as I mentioned at the beginning, such as gender identity, sexual orientation, LGBT rights, human rights, outness, hate crimes, and honor killings travel to the Turkish context. I investigate the effects produced by the employment and deployment of these terms in larger debates in and around Turkey, and analyze the kinds of discussions they enter, the conversations they open up, and the dialogues they foreclose. So this is going to be a 2-second slide, but I'm more than happy to talk about it more later. So my research involved a total of 12.5 months of fieldwork and 65 in-depth semi-structured interviews with current and former LGBT activists, members of the bear subculture, transvestite and transsexual sex workers, and workers and clients of a women-only bar. And in addition, I traced the news media and public discussion forums, some of which I will talk about today. So I'm more than happy to go into the details of why the format of the research and what I exactly did, etc., during the Q&A. So similarly, the book outline will happen very quickly so that I can actually get to the story, but I'm more than happy to tell you more about it during the Q&A. So the book traces the travel of these concepts I mentioned through 4 case studies. A recent production of an Islamic backlash against homosexuality, the chapter I'm going to talk about today, which is the story of an, in quotes, gay honor killing, transsexual and transvestite sex workers, citizenship and neoliberalism, and finally class dynamics between activists and non-activist LGBT subjects in urban Turkey. So moving on to our story for today. Oops, sorry. Oh. The assassination of Ahmet Yıldız, a 26-year-old gay man at the time of his murder, hit the Turkish news the day after Ahmet was shot to death in the Üsküdar neighborhood of Istanbul on July 16, 2008. Through talking about this story, its national and transnational circulation, as well as the release of a recent movie called Zenne, which unfortunately I will get to talk about only a little bit during the talk, but we can talk a lot more during the Q&A. This movie that's loosely based on Ahmet's story, I will be making 3 major points. So the points will be following these 3 key terms. The first one will be about outness, the second one about the transnational discourses of gay rights and families we choose, and the third one will be on honor killings. So to elaborate on these are the arguments I will be making. So first, I will argue that a closer look at Ahmet's life and death shows how this story complicates the narrative of aspirations for an out and proud life, countered by backwards traditions that some formulations of the story would have. Secondly, I will be arguing that the transnational circulation of the story was enabled by an already established framework of international gay rights and a sensibility of queer families of choice. These frameworks inform how stories such as Ahmet's will be framed in order to circulate, including as a cultural product as seen in the movie Zenne, and B, produce their own object spaces and positions, as we will see in the story of the sole witness to Ahmet's murder, a single mother, Ümmühan Darama, who was also injured during the shooting that took Ahmet's life. And I'll be arguing that these hide other subject positions that do not fall under heteronormativity, but they're not recognized as such. This point also connects to the title of my talk that asks, who killed Ahmet Yıldız? As my presentation will make clear that I'm not really interested in the truth of what really happened, the question of who really killed Ahmet Yıldız, but more in the question of why this question and what this question hides. So I will show that such a liberal and judicial understanding of justice, where justice is delivered by locating and punishing the culprit, and the framing that follows from this understanding of justice hides other injustices, as well as alternative epistemologies through which to understand Ahmet's story. Finally, my last point will be that the frame of honor killing presents family violence as nationally as a Kurdish and transnationally as an Eastern pathology, reinforcing the link between sexuality, racialization, and civilization. The transnational relegation of family violence to the so-called East produces and sustains the myth that the West is the place for stranger danger, and hence shores up West-East binary while veiling the structures that enable the production of Western normativities US queer theorists have been discussing, devoid of their transnational context. You can also read this as, I'm arguing everybody should be interested in Turkey. So the theoretical interventions I'm making through these points are these. So through the first point, I will be suggesting that we broaden our understanding of what constitutes the political and what speech acts, in fact, do make interruptions in normative orders. Through the second point, I will be arguing, making three theoretical interventions that our discussions of justice need to take into consideration what counts as a legible subject and as a minority and who is left out of those discourses. I will be suggesting we put pressure on the privileging of eventful sudden deaths and expand our understanding of violence to consider everyday slow deaths of citizens. And I will be also arguing that we need to have an expansive understanding of who is left out of national belonging and proper citizenship, and challenge heteronormativity as that which produces a homo-hetero-binary and not by reproducing that very same binary. Right? And then finally, I'm making an intervention in suggesting that for a transnational rethinking of normativities, both produced in the Turkish context and in what's considered the Western context. So let's move on to the story. Ahmet's death was reported in the national media immediately after his death, and all 6 Turkish papers that reported on the incident mentioned that Ahmet was a gay man and that he had been receiving threats from his family, and had filed an official complaint with Istanbul Governor's Office, which had not granted Ahmet any protection. While all these news pieces acknowledged that Ahmet's death might be related to the fact that he was gay, and that to the threats he had been receiving from his family, it was the British paper, The Independent, that for the first time used the term honor killing to talk about Ahmet's murder. So here you see the beginning of the piece published in The Independent. Several days after Ahmet's death, The Independent ran a full-page piece featuring the story with a headline, Was Ahmet Yıldız the victim of Turkey's first gay honor killing? The piece suggested that Ahmet was a victim of, in quotes, an increasingly liberal society and its entrenched conservative traditions, end of quote, and frictions between, citing from a Lambda Istanbul activist. Lambda Istanbul is the sort of large activist organization which was the major LGBT organization when I was in the field, and I did most of my ethnography with them. So citing from an activist from that group, it was a result of frictions between, in quotes, old mentalities and growing civil liberties. These frictions were due to Turkey's recent liberalization and hence its inevitable transition towards becoming a country that respects civil liberties, the paper explained. In quotes, Turkey was all but close to the world until 1980, but its desire for European Union membership has imposed, it's hard to read this without smiling, has imposed strains on a society formerly kept on a tight leash. Conveniently leaving out the fact that 1980 also marks the last and arguably the bloodiest military coup in the Turkish Republic that led to the crushing of the left in the nation, as well as details such as how the unleashing of the nation formerly on a tight leash resulted in an ever-expanding foreign debt, leading to a major economic crisis in 2001. The Independent employed a popular neoliberal storyline of civil, and in this case gay rights, as signs of democracy and progress. Only able to recognize murder of bodies intelligible as gay, as violence, this framework also fails to see the fact that the appointment of a Minister of Economy to Turkey following the aforementioned economic crisis by the IMF and World Bank entirely circumvented democratic electoral processes, and that the structural adjustment policies imposed by these organizations on liberal economies that fail, in quotes, constitute simply another form of tight leash and unfold into slow deaths of many citizens. This is in many ways what Chandan Reddy in his recent book has termed freedom with violence. The Independent's narrative, based on such narrow neoliberal understanding of freedom, also informed the paper's presentation of Ahmet as a young man who just wanted to live a happy out life. It was publicizing one's liberalness in the face of entrenched conservative traditions that was putting LGBT people like him in danger. So outness was a major narrative in both the news. Ahmet was killed by his family because he was gay and because he had come out to his parents. And also in activist circles, as well as among Ahmet's friends, most of whom belong to the bear subculture. I can explain this a bit more during the Q&A if it's unfamiliar first to some of you. Outness was presented both as an individual choice, Ahmet had chosen to come out to his parents and wanted to live a happy and out life, and was informed by what Cedric termed the epistemology of the closet. This epistemology is not only constitutive of, we're not there yet, sorry. This epistemology is not only constitutive of and constituted by a homo-hetero split, but produces two and only two ontological possibilities, right? One is out or one is not, and hence one is closeted. Joseph Massad has critiqued what he sees as an increasing imposition of this epistemology by international LGBT activism onto, in his case, the Arab world, and has argued that the imposition of the homo-hetero binary onto desiring subjects only works to further heterosexualize the world. However, I want to suggest, at least for the Turkish case, but other scholars are doing it for other parts of the Middle East as well, there are alternatives to a rigid epistemology of the closet on one hand and an authentic sexuality and desires untouched by Western imperialism on the other. For instance, during a special meeting called to discuss the protest to be staged for Ahmet's murder on the terrace of Lambda Istanbul offices, the LGBT organization I just mentioned, one of the Lambda Istanbul activists reported to the rest of us that two of Ahmet's friends had given an interview to the Daily Sabah earlier in the day using Lambda Istanbul's offices, where they, he had overheard them making statements such as, Ahmet shouldn't have told his parents that he was gay. While Lambda Istanbul didn't have a rigid politics that demanded everyone who is gay to come out, and they were very careful about cameras not taking images of those who were not out to their families during meetings and protests, they nevertheless held outness as an ideal that would be realized by anyone who would want to and felt safe to do so, and ideally by every LGBT subject one day. Yet a closer look at the conversations that took place during the interview show how Ahmet's friends complicate this narrative, where they identify as gays or bears, do not believe in coming out, and lead a life refusing to fold into a heteronormative order their parents wish for them, which most heavily involve getting married and having children. So when their parents brought up marriage, for instance, they responded with, "It will happen if it's my kismet, if it's my fate," or pointed out examples of unhappy marriages around them. Hence, they didn't engage in marriage refusal by coming out, but by situating marriage as an institution that is, one, a path that leads to unhappiness for enough people that one should question it as a social good, and B, a path simply not meant for everyone, so not prescribable, right, as a social institution. So many of the bears I had the chance to speak with, a number of whom had known Ahmet in person, shared similar positions on coming out in general and Ahmet's outness in particular. While such responses were seen as apolitical and as against the ultimate ideal of outness and made Lambda Istanbul activists nervous, because they were heard as anti-coming out statements, I suggest that we need to move beyond individual acts of coming out as the only political interruptions of a heteronormative order and see what kinds of important political potentials are encapsulated by these acts of marriage resistance. While these statements are not made out of political concerns and are positioned as idare etmek, sort of to manage the situation by the men who engage in it, by destabilizing marriage as a social good that can be uniformly prescribed to subjects, these men are ultimately refusing the promise of happiness offered by the institution of marriage, but also refusing the promise of happiness offered by coming out. So here I'm questioning what counts as a political speech act. Further, Ahmet himself offers a complex narrative around questions of outness in a letter he wrote for the online bear magazine Beargi 6 months before he was murdered. While Ahmet's piece was entitled, "Don't Lie, Take Off Your Mask and Be Proud," he expressed conflicting feelings around coming out and being out and sounded cautious about recommending it. So this is an excerpt from the letter he wrote. "The theoretical experiences I had gained from my friends told me that I would be telling the truth and feel proud. Yes, I am proud because I have gotten rid of lies, but know that you will be starting a difficult fight and always avoid telling them if you think it will be hard for your family to understand you." Situating a simple conception of outness equaling pride and joy as theoretical, Ahmet clearly complicates any out and proud rhetoric and ends his letter with a suggestion that the readers avoid telling their parents if they believe their parents will have a hard time understanding them. This gesture towards an epistemic break between families and selves cannot be accounted for by a simple rhetoric of homophobia, backwards cultures, and violent families. While he claims some pride and does understand telling the truth about his sexuality to be important, Ahmet nevertheless voices ambiguity about the disjuncture between theory and practice, and is torn between feeling happy to no longer live with lies and the difficulties he now experiences as a result of having come out. Not having fulfilled its promise of happiness, outness as a gay social good occupies a more ambiguous place in this narrative than the media portrayals of the story would have, that prescribe certain forms of being and living as a gay man. This narrative would become further solidified in the movie Zenne, which uses the tagline, "Truth sometimes kills," producing gay identity as Ahmet's undeniable truth. Ahmet's murder, of course, happened in a transnational world where not only news flowed in and out of the national context of Turkey, but also narratives and discourses informed by transnational identity movements and sexual subcultures. Soon after Ahmet's death, his friends produced the following YouTube video. So I'm hoping I can make this work. Let's see. Oops. Well, I might have to. Oh, there we go. Maybe there's another player in this computer that requires. Well, I'll just tell you about it. In the video, I was going to give you a break, but now you have to keep listen to me talk on and on. So, okay, so this is what happens in the video. There are men who look into the camera from all over the world in different languages, and sometimes in English with an accent, who say their name and where they're from, and then they say, "Ahmet is my family," or "Ahmet is part of my family." It's played, I mean, you should hear the music because it's played next to like really sort of emotionally loaded music, and they sort of continue doing this for a minute, a little over a minute. And you presumably these men are members of a transnational bear culture, and then towards the end of the clip, we see these two signs. One that says Ahmet Yıldız was a victim of a gay honor killing, solidifying this notion of an honor killing. And second, Ahmet Yıldız missed by his real family. While such transnational embrace of Ahmet as a member of a family who loves and accepts him for who he is well-intentioned, families we choose as a narrative framework creates a distinction between right kinds of families and wrong kinds of families, thereby hiding the fact that family as an institution is home to all kinds of violences, ranging from incest to domestic violence. As honor killing travels internationally to tell the story of what happens to gay people in backwards third world countries, it is used to discipline kinship structures into becoming neoliberal families, where family is supposed to function as a safe haven and provides love, support, and protection, and any other sort of, in quote, social services citizens might need. This is exemplified in the Istanbul Governor's Office's initial rejection to provide protection to Ahmet when he filed a complaint against threats he was receiving from his family, and the subsequent murder trial, at the end of which Ahmet's father was charged with the crimes and found guilty. Sentiments evoked by Ahmet is My Family video embody and foster such neoliberal constructions of family, critiquing failed families that have failed on a neoliberal scale of success and reminding us what a real family means. Disconnected from blood ties, it is those who care for you, love you unconditionally, and even better for who you are. So this video circulated on several websites, including a tribute site for Ahmet, and one YouTube link that received possibly the highest, at least I could find, possibly the highest circulation with over 50,000 views, featured over 300 comments, mostly echoing the sentiments in the video. But there were, in addition, several other voices that emerged that were critical of who or what they thought had killed Ahmet Yıldız. So while comments such as Islam, here we go, is a peaceful and tolerant religion, sarcasm, crafted a direct link between Islam as religion and honor killings in general, and killing of a gay man in particular, other comments such as, there's many more of these, I selected 3 for you. Other comments such as, I feel bad for the GLBT communities in Muslim countries, it's just so bad over there, very sad, imagined Islam as a national trait / culture. Others were threatened by the proximity of Islamic / barbaric Turkey. If Turkey will be an EU member, we're going to let Spain feed them. Is that okay with you? So you have to deal with the English of internet users here. Want it or not, Turkey is a Muslim country. You can't change their traditions. and configured Islam as tradition. So you can see it's like moves from religion to national trait to tradition. But either as religion, national trait, or tradition, Islam was imagined to be at the root of honor killings. So while transnational circuits were linking honor killing to Islam with few voices contesting it, the court case back in Istanbul was, so we're moving from, basically we moved from wrong families to wrong religion, and now we're going to disrupt that narrative. So while transnational circuits were linking honor killing to Islam with few voices contesting it, the court case back in Istanbul was getting ready to move forth with a single witness. Ümmühan Darama who had been initially featured in all the national news as the potential target of the bullets that killed Ahmet, this woman who was basically injured that I just mentioned at the beginning. Yet she was dropped from the news altogether once The Independent framed the story as a gay honor killing. So this is her, actually, and this is a picture taken by the newspaper Radikal. That was the only paper that actually had a lengthy interview with her in the Turkish news as well. So as a woman with Islamic education from a very early age on, she gave private group seminars on Islamic living besides having owned several businesses, the last one of which was the cafe in front of which Ahmet was shot. During our lengthy interview, Darama told me that she herself was suspecting that she might have been the target of the bullets. She had been married to a man via Islamic matrimony, which has no legal standing in Turkey without also conducting a secular official engagement. Her ex-husband, with whom she had a son, had been shot to death 9 years ago at the time of our interview. She suspected that was due to some scam he got involved in. That sounded really similar to the Madoff case when she talked about it. While her husband, Mehmet Akarçeşme, had registered their son officially as his son, the uncles who did not want the son to receive any inheritance had had the link removed, Darama told me. So she had been fighting for this inheritance right. She didn't know how much money was involved, but had traveled to Switzerland to find out about the bank account that she suspected was there. And she told me since she started going after her son's inheritance, her businesses started getting attacked. In fact, the cafe in front of which Ahmet was shot at again 3 months after Ahmet's death, which happened in the middle of the night, so nobody was around to be heard. And this incident was featured in the news actually, but nobody really followed up on any links to Ahmet's death or this woman. Darama took that as a warning, we call it gözdağı in Turkish, and closed the cafe mostly because she was worried for her employees' well-being. While she was confused about how her own fight for justice for her son might have coincided with Ahmet's death, she strongly believed there was a link and that this court case might result in finally exposing and penalizing those who had been trying to harm her businesses and intimidate her into giving up on her son's inheritance. While Ahmet's story, in quotes, gay honor killing, received international media attention and easily fit into the narratives of transnational justice movements and hence was able to mobilize them, other sexual others of the Turkish nation, such as Muslim single mothers who only engage in Islamic matrimony, do not have any transnational or for that matter national movements that will support their search for justice. Not recognized by the legitimizing institutions of the nation state and by national and transnational movements for justice, figures such as Ümmühan Darama, truly queer identitarian movements that are able to recognize only othering but not objection. What I mean by this is that Ahmet's story becomes recognizable transnationally the moment he is called a gay subject who was the target of undeniable violence. Right? Darama, on the other hand, doesn't constitute a recognizable subject position that is already established as a minority in a liberal framework, and neither is the continuous battle she has to fight with both the state institutions and with these sort of invisible powers that are after her. She is suspecting our male kin of her now deceased husband, are identified as violence. This is not only true for international media who didn't pick up on the story, but also the LGBT activists and Ahmet's friends and his boyfriend fighting for justice for Ahmet's murder. They were all very grateful that she was willing to be a participant and a witness for this case, but they really didn't know anything about her story. And this is really not to portray Darama as an opportunist, and I hope I make clear the structural impossibilities for her fight to exert the kind of pressure transnationally backed justice movements are able to do. So, you know, I'm not saying like, oh, she's an opportunist jumping on the bandwagon of this like gay rights movement. Further, Darama's desire to be a witness for Ahmet's case was also informed by her beliefs as a Muslim woman. Homosexuality is haram, but murder is the biggest sin, she had told to the Daily Radical in this interview where the picture was taken. Which was the only Turkish paper, like I mentioned, that featured a lengthy conversation with her. When I asked her to elaborate on this during our interview, she told me that murder is absolutely unacceptable in Islam and subjects, kullar, do not have the right to punish. She added, homosexuality is haram, but so is smoking. Chain smoking during our 3.5-hour conversation, which involved a brief interruption for her to buy another pack. It's true story. She explained that the reason homosexuality was haram, just like smoking, was because it was harmful to the human body, that after all we all borrowed from Allah. But during my seminars, married couples also asked me about this. So what are you going to do, she said, referring to anal penetration. Treating homosexuality as nothing but sex acts, and hence doing away with the homo-hetero binary on one hand, referring to the married couples who are consulting her about this, and portraying an individualistic understanding of religious duty and sin on the other, Darama both disrupts the epistemology of the closet that informs the dominant narrative around Ahmet's story and discourses of liberal tolerance. And I want to quickly note here that one thing that I'm trying to do in another chapter is sort of to think about a concept of sort of the right to sin. Like, can we think of a right to sin as a possible intervention in contemporary discourses around homosexuality and Islam in Turkey? Brian Silverstein's work that shows the sort of historically individualistic form of Islam in the late Ottoman and Turkish context is actually really useful for such conceptualization. So if gay honor killing is an archive that gains robustness, coherence, and consistency as it circulates, including incitement of Islamophobic reactions transnationally, then Darama is a figure that haunts this archive and its easy narratives of exclusion, violence, and justice. I suggest that queer politics in Turkey would gain a lot from moving beyond the possibilities of possibilities of identity-based LGBT politics, and having an expansive vision of what forms of violences are being distributed to all kinds of citizen subjects because their sexualities, intimacies, and kinship formations are left outside of the legitimizing institutions of the nation state. Finally, I want to point out that gay honor killing works as a narrative that contributes to a national as well as transnational division of labor between what is considered to be the West versus the non-West, mapping family violence onto the non-West and producing the myth of onto the sort of uncivilized territories, and producing the myth of the West or the civilized as the location of stranger danger. So within Turkey, honor killings are traditionally attributed to Kurdish feudal customs referred to as töre. Dicle Kağcıoğlu aptly termed this move the tradition effect and has warned us against blaming it on tradition, given such analysis erase the state's responsibilities in cases of honor killings by pulling funding from shelters, police insensitivity towards women trying to run away from violent marriages or difficult family situations. What I want to add to her eloquent analysis is a caution against the privileged place of sudden and eventful death, as violence in discussions of honor killings usually has. Many slow deaths are died in the hands of family members as well as other social institutions. And these need to be part of our thinking about violence. So in this slide, I want to ask what counts as newsworthy, eventful death or murder? Right, a consideration of slow deaths is especially necessary in the context of the historical and current treatment of Kurdish subjects by the Turkish state, which today includes arbitrary detentions and jailings that have resulted in a recent hunger strike that sees in its 66th day very recently, luckily with no deaths. While töre custom provides a racializing script in the nation that produces honor killings as a Kurdish pathology and singles out sudden deaths as newsworthy or real violence, adding to the neoliberal understanding of the family as a safe haven, the unnaming of the distribution of slow deaths to many Kurdish children and adults by the Turkish state continues to mark such violence as less significant because it is seen as less murderous. In Ahmet's case, the Kurdish family is produced not only as backwards in their understanding of gender equality, which regular honor killings establish, but also as homophobic. The movie Zenne adds to this narrative, which is no small movie. This movie was made about Ahmet Yıldız. It's supposedly loosely based on Ahmet's life, but Ahmet is a main figure and has gotten a lot of awards and a lot of media attention in Turkey. So the movie adds to this narrative by a portrayal of Ahmet's mother as extremely religious, but also obsessed with family honor. The portrayal of Ahmet's family as lower middle class in the movie links civilizational expectations of lower classes and lower races to go hand in hand, even though a number of men I interviewed about the movie mentioned that Ahmet's family was wealthy, unlike the uneducated and lower class portrayal on screen. Sharvan, a friend of Ahmet and a Kurdish man himself, was rightfully frustrated with the movie's narrative. They keep portraying Kurds as backwards, he said, but the number one political party to defend LGBT rights in this country is BDP, which is Peace and Democracy Party, the major active Kurdish political party in the nation. Such contradictions are a reminder of the success of the Kurds as backwards on traditional narrative in the nation, that despite everything that BDP is doing, this narrative can persist. On the other hand, the use of honor killing, there we go, situates Ahmet's murder as an Eastern, and in some contexts, as you have seen, a Muslim form of crime, and hence provides a constitutive outside for Western homonormativity. Scholars such as Joseph Massad have questioned the very term honor killing, pointing out that a third of all women killed in the US are murdered by their husbands, boyfriends, or fathers, yet no specific term exists to name such killings a particular form of Western pathology. Through the employment of honor killing, family violence is relegated to the East, in quotes, to conserve both the Western family romance and the myth of stranger danger. Yes. Critics of neoliberalism in the West, especially in relation to feminist and queer movements such as Gillian Harkins, have shown how during the late 80s and 90s, a discourse about incest proliferated in the US, yet legislations were made about pedophilia imagined as stranger molestation. So there was a shift from in-home sexual abuse to stranger sexual abuse, shifting the focus from harm to risk, and producing the child at risk on behalf of which preemptive regulations would ensue. Similarly, Erica Miners has argued that the contemporary construction of child sexual abuse as resulting from stranger danger doesn't fairly represent the problem of sexual violence against children. What I suggest is that this production of stranger danger as exemplified in the logic of hate crimes, for instance, works to solidify histories that have replaced a focus on incest with pedophilia, shifting the responsibility of child sexual abuse from heterosexual fathers to gay male unknowns, and more recently, the potential of gay adoptive fathers as a risk. Further, such theories about danger and crime are produced in the transnational context of relegating family crimes to the Eastern, in quotes, cultures of shame, supposedly distinguishing essential elements of the East versus the West as marked by shame versus guilt, which work to veil the shaming practices that happen in the US high school hallways and classrooms that lead to a lot of young queer people to take their lives. West as the location of stranger danger also hides the domestic violence and abuse perpetrated in Western homes, both on queer and non-queer bodies. So attention to transnational discourses and such as these help resituate the current discussions around neoliberalism and homonormativity in the West from being imagined in relationship to particular normativities produced within the American nation, for instance, to considering over and against which nations and bodies such projects are built. So to basically go over this, I am proposing a parallel between what happens nationally and what happens transnationally that circulates through the location of family violence and links race, family, sexuality to civilization altogether. So to conclude, this is a picture I took at the last Pride March in Istanbul, summer of 2012. As you can see, friends of, so if you cannot read it, it says Ahmet Yıldız get his murderers, katillerini istiyorum in Turkish. As you can see, friends of Ahmet and members of the Bears still march with signs demanding justice for Ahmet's murder. When I ask, what does the question, who killed Ahmet Yıldız, hide? That's not to undermine efforts that are seeking justice for Ahmet's murder. But it is to suggest that at a time when resorting to the cultural, as Lila Abuluhod would say, is more convenient and easily evoked than ever to explain the non-West, and serves as a nijak for political, economic, and social histories that have produced its current conditions, histories often linked to colonialism and imperialism, I believe that both queer studies and Middle East studies have a lot to gain from thinking of the social and cultural structures we study in their transnational context. This is not only critical because we live in a world of increasing transnational connectivity with diasporas and other patterns of immigration, but also because language, knowledge, and ways of thinking about the world travel more intensely than ever before, and we all live our lives in the light and the shadows of narratives that unfold within the context of such connectivity. Thank you.
All right, well, we've got some time for questions. And